In the city of Worms, West Germany, 1954. As a nation rebuilds from the ashes of war, a different kind of destruction is taking root behind the lace curtains of the suburbs. In the kitchen of a seemingly perfect housewife, coffee isn't just an energy boost, and chocolate isn't a treat. It is a death warrant. In just 5 years, 3 people, a husband, a father-in-law, and a dear friend, collapsed in violent convulsions under the cold gaze of the same woman. Doctors spoke of bad luck and natural causes, but the truth was far more sinister. It was a chemical formula. The substance known as E605. Today, we open the file on Christa Lehmann, the woman who turned hospitality into a weapon of mass execution. Let's go deep into the well. The early 1950s in West Germany was a time of desperate silence. The war had ended less than a decade prior, and the people of Worms, like the rest of the country, were eager to bury the trauma of the past under a layer of clean tablecloths and new appliances. This was the era of the economic miracle. Amidst this backdrop of forced sunshine stood Christa Lehmann. To her neighbors, she was the definition of German domesticity, polite, well-dressed, and efficient. But beneath the floral dresses lay a fractured psyche. Born Christa Ambrose, her childhood was a masterclass in instability. Her mother had been committed to a psychiatric ward, and her father had vanished into the chaos of the era, leaving Christa to fend for herself in a world that didn't care for broken girls. She learned early on that the only person she could trust was herself, and that the only thing that mattered was survival and status. She wanted the life she saw in the glossy advertisements, a quiet home, a respectable husband, and the envy of her peers. However, Christa lacked the fundamental wiring of human empathy. Where others felt guilt or love, she felt only a cold, transactional logic. By the time she moved into the Lehmann household, she had perfected the model housewife persona. She baked, she cleaned, and she smiled. She realized that in a society so obsessed with moving forward and appearing normal, a quiet death in a private home would rarely be questioned. The stage was set, the mask was fixed, and the only thing Christa needed was a tool, something silent. Karl Franz Lehmann was a man of simple habits. A hard-working upholsterer, he was Christa's ticket to the respectability she so desperately sought. But the reality of marriage was far from the magazine pages. Karl was a heavy drinker, a man whose presence in the house began to feel like a weight around Christa's neck. He was loud, he was messy, and increasingly, he was an inconvenience. In the mind of a woman like Christa, an inconvenience was a problem with a chemical solution. With Karl in the ground, Christa expected freedom and control over the family's assets. But she hadn't accounted for Valentin Lehmann, Karl's father. Valentin was a man of the old world, stern, frugal, and deeply suspicious of his daughter-in-law's sudden modern spending habits. He held the purse strings of the family business, and he held them tight. To Christa, Valentin wasn't a grieving father, he was a barrier. He was the only thing standing between her and the bank account that would fund her ideal life. The atmosphere in the Lehmann house during the summer of 1953 was suffocating. Valentin's grief was sharp, and his eyes followed Christa through the rooms. He criticized her. He was an anchor that refused to let go. Christa decided it was time for Valentin to join his son. On a warm afternoon, she prepared a drink for the old man. Again, the ritual was domestic and calm. She handed him the glass with a steady hand. The reaction was identical. Valentin collapsed, his body arching in the same horrific spasms that had claimed Karl. The doctors were called once more, but this time, the anomaly was even more glaring. 2 healthy men in the same household dying of the same mysterious symptoms within a year. It should have raised alarms. But the authorities were blinded by a combination of social respectability and medical laziness. Valentin was old, they reasoned. The shock of losing his son must have triggered a stroke. They wrote the death certificate, offered their condolences, and left Christa alone in a house that was now entirely hers. Her weapon was not the arsenic of the Victorian era or the rare toxins of a spy novel, it was modern, industrial, and terrifyingly accessible. It was parathion, known commercially in West Germany as E605. Originally synthesized by IG Farben, the same chemical giant associated with the darkest days of the war, E605 was designed as a nerve agent. When the war ended, it was rebranded as a miracle pesticide, a liquid death for the rodents and insects that plagued the nation's farms. Christa was not a chemist, but she possessed a predator's intuition for tools. She discovered that E605 was the perfect accomplice. It was a clear, yellowish fluid that, when diluted, became virtually undetectable to the human senses. No bitter taste like cyanide, no metallic tang like arsenic. It worked by attacking the nervous system, specifically inhibiting the enzyme cholinesterase. Without this enzyme, the body's muscles receive a continuous, unrelenting signal to contract. The result is a total systemic overload, violent spasms, respiratory failure, and finally, a heart that simply cannot beat against the wall of its own convulsing muscles. We follow Christa's shadow as she visits the local garden supply stores in Worms. In 1954, you didn't need a license to buy a bottle of E605, you just needed a few marks and a reason to kill garden pests. Christa bought it with the same casual air as one might buy laundry soap. Back in her kitchen, she experimented with dosages, learning exactly how much was needed to mimic a medical emergency without leaving an obvious chemical trail. She was a pioneer in domestic terror, transforming a common agricultural tool into a silent executioner. The pesticide sat in her cabinet, hidden behind jars of flour and sugar, a ghost in a bottle, waiting for its next invitation to the dinner table. By February 1954, Christa Lehmann had successfully cleared her home of obstacles, but her hunger for control had not been satiated. She had turned her sights toward her social circle. Annie Hammond was Christa's closest friend, or so the town of Worms believed. They were often seen together, two young women navigating the post-war world. But Annie possessed things that Christa envied: a vibrant energy, a stable family life, and perhaps, secrets that Christa found threatening. In the twisted logic of a serial poisoner, friendship is not a bond, it is an opportunity for a final, cruel demonstration of power. On a Tuesday that seemed like any other, Christa walked to Annie's house. In her hand, she carried a small, decorative box. Inside was a single chocolate praline, a truffle laced with a lethal dose of E605. This was the moment Christa's methodology shifted from cleaning house to a more sadistic form of sport. She wanted to be there to witness the transition. As they sat in the living room, Christa offered the gift. It was a gesture of friendship, a sweet treat for a cold afternoon. Annie took the chocolate. She bit into the rich cocoa, unaware that the center was hollowed out and filled with liquid agony. The effect was almost instantaneous. Within minutes, the vibrant Annie Hammond was on the floor. Her mother watched in horror as her daughter's face contorted into a mask of pain. This wasn't the slow decline of the elderly Valentine, this was a violent, screaming neurological collapse. As Annie's body betrayed her, Christa stood by, offering hollow words of comfort, playing the role of the shocked friend while her eyes remained fixed on the dying woman. But this time, the monster had been too bold. Annie was young, healthy, and she had died in the presence of a witness who remembered exactly where that chocolate had come from. The bad luck of Christa Lehmann was about to run out. The death of Annie Hammond sent a shockwave through the local medical community that the previous deaths had failed to trigger. When a young woman with no history of illness drops dead in 15 minutes, the excuse of heart failure no longer suffices. The local prosecutor, George Kurt, was a man who paid attention to patterns. He looked at the files of the Lehmann household, 3 deaths in 5 years, all with identical, violent symptoms. He ordered a full toxicology report, a rarity in an era where autopsies were often seen as a secondary formality. Forensic science in 1954 was standing on the threshold of a new age, but it was still ill-equipped for a ghost like E605. There was no standardized test for parathion in human tissue. The toxicologists at the University of Mainz were working in the dark. For days, the scientists searched for traditional poisons: strychnine, cyanide, thallium. They found nothing. The case threatened to go cold, which would have allowed Christa to walk free and find her next victim. However, a breakthrough came from a young researcher who decided to test a theory about agricultural chemicals. He applied a specific reagent to a sample of Annie's liver tissue. The lab fell silent as the clear liquid began to change color, turning a deep, undeniable yellow. It was the chemical signature of E605. It was the first time in German history that this specific pesticide had been identified as the cause of a criminal poisoning. The veil was lifted. The authorities realized they were dealing with a calculated, scientific killer who had turned the modern world's tools against it. Once Annie Hammond's cause of death was confirmed, the prosecutor knew that his investigation could not stop with her. He needed to prove a pattern. In the dead of night, under a cold, drizzling rain, the police and forensic teams gathered. The heavy thud of shovels against the wet earth was the only sound in the silent field of graves. The coffins of Karl and Valentin Lehmann were raised from the soil. The investigators feared that time and decay might have erased the evidence, but they found the opposite. In an anomaly of chemistry, the high concentrations of E605 had acted as a crude preservative, slowing the natural process of decomposition. The forensic teams worked quickly, taking samples of hair, skin, and internal organs. Back at the Mainz laboratory, the results were even more staggering than the first. Both men were saturated with the pesticide. The evidence was now irrefutable. 3 bodies, 1 chemical, and 1 common denominator, Christa Lehmann. They provided the testimony that no living witness could. The polite housewife who was currently sleeping in her warm bed had no idea that at that very moment, the remains of her family were convicting her in a laboratory miles away. The arrest of Christa Lehmann was not a high-speed chase or a violent standoff. When the police entered her home, they found a woman who seemed more annoyed by the interruption than terrified by the charges. In the interrogation room, Christa sat across from them, her posture perfect, her expression as flat and unreadable as a frozen lake. The detectives began to lay out the forensic evidence, the yellow stains in the test tubes, the reports from the cemetery, the testimony of Annie's mother. For hours, she maintained her innocence with a chilling, monotone no. But the detectives were patient. They leaned into the psychological vacuum of her narcissism. They didn't appeal to her guilt, because she had none, they appealed to her pride. They spoke of the cleverness of the method, the uniqueness of using E605. Finally, the mask cracked, not out of remorse, but out of a desire to be understood. Christa began to speak. She described the murders as administrative tasks. Karl was a nuisance. Valentin was a burden. Annie was an irritation. She was a woman who had completely severed the connection between action and consequence. To the men in that room, it was the most terrifying sound they had ever heard, the sound of a human being who had replaced their soul with a formula. The trial of Christa Lehmann in September 1954 became a cultural phenomenon that shook the foundations of West Germany. The courtroom in Worms was transformed into a theater of the macabre. International journalists flocked to the city, eager to see the woman the headlines were calling the Witch of Worms and the Borgia of the Rhine. Germany was trying to project an image of a civilized, reconstructed society, yet here was a Medea in an apron, a reminder that the capacity for horror had not disappeared with the fall of the regime. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, but the most damning part was Christa herself. Throughout the testimony of the grieving families and the technical reports of the toxicologists, she remained motionless. The defense attempted to paint her as a victim of war hysteria, a woman broken by the trauma of the bombings and the collapse of society. They argued she was in a state of diminished responsibility, a casualty of the era's chaos. But the jury saw a different picture. They saw the cold, calculated way she had purchased the poison months in advance and the precision with which she had administered it. Christa Lehmann was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. She had achieved the fame she always craved, but it was the fame of a monster. Christa herself became a living ghost within the prison system. She was a model prisoner, once again donning the mask of the polite, helpful woman. In 1971, after serving nearly 18 years, she was quietly released. The woman who had paralyzed a nation with a chocolate truffle was given a new identity and allowed to slip into the shadows of a society that had finally begun to forget her. She lived out in anonymity, a white-haired grandmother figure who walked the same streets as the families of her victims. She died in 1990, taking her final thoughts to a grave that, unlike those of her victims, would never be disturbed. We end this report where we began, in the quiet suburbs. The case of Christa Lehmann remains the standard for the domestic monster. She proved that evil doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes, it sits at your table. It smiles at you over a cup of coffee. It offers you a piece of chocolate. Subscribe, ring the bell, and thanks for watching. Don't forget. I'll see you at the bottom of the well.